Welcome to today's keynote at the International Conference on the Early Modern Period in Games at Oldenburg University. Thank you for joining us this evening, either here in Oldenburg or online. I think we have 40 people online. Today we have the special pleasure of welcoming one of the most famous game developers in the USA today, known for his work on the Fallout games, but also on the game Pentiment, which is very popular among us humanities scholars and of which we will speak today, mainly. I'm sure those of you who haven't played it yet will be eager after the event, but most of us have already played it, so to say. It's a truly remarkable game. Josh, I want to express my deep gratitude for traveling from the USA to speak to us today and for staying here throughout the conference, which especially is impressive because the conference is also being held partly in German today and tomorrow. It is a great pleasure and honor to have you with us, particularly as we showcase our current research, not only from Germany, Switzerland, and Austria, but also from the UK, France, Sweden, and many other parts of the world. The idea to invite Josh was admittedly not entirely random. Some time ago, my colleague Alan van Beek and I had the rather bold idea of approaching Josh on the well-known social media platform, I won't say the name, to see if he would like to talk to us about Pentiment, and to our delight, he took the bait, and we were able to conduct an interview, and then together with Aurelia Brandenburg, we started editing an anthology, which we are now celebrating later the publication of today. What better occasion for publishing an edited volume about a game than an event where you meet with the actual game developer. So we will have a roughly 45-minute keynote, followed by a short Q&A, and then Alan and Aurelia will speak more on the edited volume. Afterwards, we'll go for dinner again. Some info on Josh, for those who don't know you. Josh Sawyer started in the game industry in 1999 at Black Isle Studios, where he worked on the Icewind Dale games. Since 2005, he has been at Obsidian Entertainment, where he has directed Fallout, New Vegas, Pillars of Eternity 2, Deadfire, and the 2022 narrative adventure game, Pentiment. He's currently Obsidian's studio design director. The title of your talk is Illuminating Those Who Illuminated Me, Micro and Macrohistorical Sources for Pentiment. The stage is yours.
Lukas hat mir gesagt, dass ich ein paar Worte auf Deutsch sprechen sollte. Entschuldigung. Ja, das ist für mich ein Traum. Ich bin kein Akademiker, nur ein Computerspielentwickler. Aber als ich ein Kind war, habe ich ein Spiel, nennt Darklands, gespielt. Und es war sehr formativ für mich. Und wenn Pentiment kann auch für Spieler, Spielerinnen, Akademikerinnen Inspiration sein, das ist fantastisch. Danke. Jetzt auf Englisch. Okay, illuminating those who illuminated me. A few content warnings and declarations here. So there are some game images and engravings of executions. They're not extremely realistic, but just be warned of it. There are unfortunately some spoilers for Pentiment. I apologize. Some of them are very spoilery, so if you're just, you can't wait, FYI. Most of the images that I've used, I didn't cite every single image in here, but most of them are from Pentiment. Those that aren't are mostly from Wikipedia and Wikimedia Commons, except this one, which is from Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. This line where Henry, as Indiana, comes in and wants his attention, and he's busy copying this illumination, and he said, may he who illuminated this illuminate me. So I'm trying to sort of illuminate the sources that I used, both in real life and primary and secondary. So Lucas already went over this. I'm Josh Sawyer. I'm the studio design director at Obsidian Entertainment. We're located in Southern California. I started my career in 1999, straight out of college. I started as a web developer for Black Isle Studios and transitioned over into game design. I've worked on Icewind Dale 1 and 2 and Neverwinter Nights 2. The games I've directed are Fallout New Vegas, Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2, and then I was the director and narrative lead for Pentiment in 2022. I do have a bachelor's degree. No one marked that, by the way, on the list. I want to go write BA next to my name. In history from Lawrence University in 1998, and I focused on the early modern Holy Roman Empire, specifically witch hunting and hagiography in that period. What is Pentiment? It is a narrative adventure game with light role-playing elements. Obsidian, and in my career, I've focused mostly on role-playing games, but the role-playing stuff takes a backseat. There aren't statistics or classes or combat or anything like that. It's mostly a narrative adventure game, but you do make choices that are formative in how the story continues. It is set in the early to mid-16th century of the Holy Roman Empire, specifically in Upper Bavaria, in a fictional abbey. It's important to note that it is not a real place, although I was very happy to see Bavarians say that they were looking to try to find where Kiersau and Tassing are. I tried to blend a bunch of elements, which I'll get to why. Kiersau is the fictional abbey, a double Benedictine abbey, and the town of Tassing that is adjacent to it. And it is located on the Via Imperii through the Brenner Pass, coming from Austria into Bavaria. Andreas Mahler is the protagonist of the story. He is a journeyman artist at this point in his life. He is from Nuremberg. He is completing his Wanderjahre. You get to decide exactly where he went on his Wanderjahre, but where he ends up is at Kiersau Abbey. He is doing some work for the scriptorium there before he goes back to Nuremberg, where a requirement of being a master is that he must get married. He has never met his bride-to-be, which becomes a plot point. It takes place over long span of time, 1518 to 1545. He winds up being entangled in a series of murders. There are not detectives, so he becomes the de facto detective trying to help his friends out. This, of course, covers the Reformation and also the Revolution of 1525. Very formative things. It also deals with, among other things, depression, gender, sexuality, marginalized people in the society, faith, history and the creation of history, and art and the creation of art. To talk about some of our goals that we had specifically with regard to how history is handled here, first of all, we did want to entertain people. So this is primarily entertainment through which the beauty of history falls on your head and you absorb it. However, within this entertainment, we wanted to create a believable fiction, authentic, let's say, within the frame of history, because Kiersau and Tassing are not real, but we wanted them to feel real. We wanted to portray people from across the social strata. The background image that's pictured here is Bruegel the Elder's The Procession to Calvary. I watched a film, The Mill and the Cross, which is an adaptation of a book that dealt with the creation of that painting. And in it, Rutger Hauer, sadly the late, great Rutger Hauer, plays Bruegel, and he says, "My painting must be big enough to hold everything, everyone, all of the people." And in this Mannerist style, Bruegel illustrated this vast cross-section of society. And for this game, I wanted to have a huge cast. We have actually over 100 characters in the game, which for a very small team was a hard thing to achieve. But I thought it was important to show many different perspectives on their society and faith and all these other things. Wanted to show the fragility and subjectivity of history. One of the major inspirations for this game was Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose, also Bottolino. Much of Eco's work deals with how fragile history really is. And in this story, which is historical, quasi-historical, you are also part of creating the story that will continue after you are gone. And also demonstrate different callings to faith. So this was a secondary point, but faith is not, and religion are not often dealt with well in games. I wanted to make a concerted effort to portray a wide range of callings to faith. So this is a Catholic society. Lutheranism is sort of creeping in, but it's still primarily, it's in Bavaria after all. It is Catholic, and the people there have a wide range of beliefs within that. Even within the religious community, there are people that are very observant, people that really don't care for it at all, and they were kind of forced into it, and I wanted to portray that. I just have a bachelor's degree. I could not do all of the research for this game. Also, I had a lot of writing and other things to do, so we did have to rely on historical consultants first and foremost. Chief among these, the first person that I talked to is Christopher de Hamel from Corpus Christi at Cambridge. He helped us deal with figuring out Andreas's educational background because I wanted him to be university educated, which I'll get into. Also, he talked to us about the state of monastic scriptoria in 1518. They didn't exist. But we worked through that. Dr. Edmund Kern was my advisor at Lawrence when I went to school there. He helped with a ton of things, including all the legal stuff that goes on in pre-Carolina legal code in the Holy Roman Empire. It was a big old mess. Not that I'm an expert on Carolina in the Holy Roman Empire, but it was even more complicated before that. Also, the trial and execution processes. These are very well documented. They are very formalized. I didn't want to get that wrong. And also sourcing a ton of texts. There were many times where I wrote to Ed and said, like, do you know where I can find anything about this? And he would say, I think I know of an article, or I think I know of a book, and he would point me to it. And then Dr. Winston Black from Francis Xavier University, he was a classmate of mine at Lawrence. My path went towards making games, and his path went towards academia. He focuses on medieval medicine. And even though we are entering the early modern period, at this point in time, much of the medicine that was practiced was still fundamentally medieval, if not ancient. So he helped us figure out the not autopsy of Baron Rotvogel. This is actually a misstep that he helped us walk back. And then there are these Bolognese doctors who are discussing Pliny's natural history, which was actually a subject at the time. So first, let's talk about Andreas' education and how the scriptorium worked. So middle classes, such as we understood them in this time period, which are kind of forming, they didn't really have great access to university education. Dr. de Hamel said that perhaps his father had a connection at a university. So we concocted this idea that Andreas' father, Joseph, was quite skilled as an artist and quite well connected with the rector of the University of Erfurt. And through the rector, he gained access to this education. Unfortunately, Andreas earned his master and then he dropped out. He burned out. Something that perhaps I know a little bit about. And he joined the family business, but his father said, okay, look, if you're gonna be an artist, you better stick with it because you just burned through a university education and it's the 16th century and that's a big deal. Also, de Hamel pretty much said, yeah, monastic scriptoria, they weren't really around at this time period. But I was really interested in showing this transition from the late Middle Ages into early modernity. And so, we talked about, well, how was this handled at this time? And he said, well, by this time, this was all pretty much handled by professionals. I knew about the guilds, but I didn't realize quite how they had completely taken over everything. So you had private artists. You also had guild artists. In Nuremberg at this time, the guilds were actually banned. So you had lots of private masters that were regulated by the city council. But in any case, it wasn't being handled by religious groups. So we just said that everyone said it's weird. So everyone comments constantly about how strange it is that Kearsarge still has a scriptorium open at this point in time when all the other ones have closed. It is presented as something that is out of the ordinary, part of Kearsarge being stuck in the past, which is a big theme. All of the legal stuff was very tricky. I don't have a ton of education on it, thankfully. So I did study the history of witch hunting. Ed Kern, that's his whole focus. And so even though we weren't talking about witch hunting, we were talking about the legal processes around it. Among other things, we talked about the fracturing of law before the Carolina. So in different regions, things were handled very arbitrarily. That's why the Carolina was formed. It was really haphazard. Who would be responsible if a nobleman were murdered within an ecclesiastical setting, like an abbey? So he helped figure out, well, probably this would fall under the abbot, but above the abbot would be the Prince Bishop of Freising, and the Prince Bishop of Freising is not going to go himself. He's going to send an archdeacon, so we worked all that out. Things like the arbitration of the widow's lease in the game. It's complicated, but there's a lot of precedent for it, so he helped us figure that out. The concept of feminine liberty, which was kind of patronizing, but it was this idea that if a man died for the interest of feminine liberty, they could inherit property from their husband and be secure in that. The concept of vis maior, which exists in legal standing right now, which is basically if a greater force, such as an act of God, war, German peasant uprising, causes a problem, you can be exempted from the contractual concerns. And then the Reichskammergericht rulings. So the Reichskammergericht was kind of notorious for taking forever to sort of arbitrate things. This was the high imperial court. So things would get promoted out of local courts and eventually reach them, sometimes years later. So he talked me through how that process would work. And the trial and execution processes. It was important I thought to show people that what they think of like a trial is not really how things worked in this time period. So inquiries didn't resemble our courts. Magistrates, or in this case the archdeacon, they would inquire with assistants, but it was pretty much them just going around and asking questions and through their agents, and then deliberations took place in private. A sentence would be pronounced and then carried out, but it's very abstract, I think, compared to what people think of in the modern day. Executions were public. We abbreviated the whole process. It was quite drawn out and quite formalized. Attendance was typically mandatory, although kids were probably not at it. We included that for dramatic effect. Guards were often necessary for a number of reasons. So, for example, if they thought that the person who was being condemned was innocent, they didn't want the people to overwhelm the executioner. Also, executioners often botched executions, and even if people didn't like the person being condemned, they would often get very aggravated and they could attack the executioner for doing it. And again, the process was highly formalized. The Bahnrichter, who would come along and would conduct the process, would formally, tell the executioner to carry out their duty and give him safe conduct. So these were all details that, some of which I got from one of our secondary sources, but also Ed filled in some of the details that I didn't have access to. He also helped with a ton of texts that I needed to source. The existence of double monasteries, I knew they existed. I took an ill-fated trip to Cloister et al., and I asked one of the brothers about the history of the abbey, and he was like, I don't know, man, why don't you go to the Staatsbibliothek in Munich? I was like, okay. So I still needed to find evidence of double monasteries, meaning houses featuring both monks and nuns within this time period in German-speaking areas. Ed did find evidence of that. There weren't a ton of them because they were outlawed centuries earlier, but they did still persist. Also, one of the trickier things was hunting by non-nobles. So it was pretty much illegal for people who were not nobles to hunt in this time period, but clearly people did it. But how did they do it? And so Ed found this text, Kultur und Jagd, ein Durchgang durch die Geschichte, by Ulrich Wendt from 1907. And the PDF he found was entirely in Fraktur. So I made my way through it, and I got the details that I needed to figure out how they would dress and how they would go out and hunt. The not autopsy of the Baron. So initially, when we had Brother Florian do the autopsy of the Baron, it was a full autopsy, and he was cutting him open, and he was digging around in there, and it was very dramatic, and depending on Andreas's backgrounds, he could pass out from it, which was very funny. They wouldn't do that. So at this time, in Bologna, there was a lot of interest in autopsy and surgery. There were even stories about university students basically stealing corpses from houses before they were buried to perform autopsies. But north of the Alps, they were like, we're not doing that stuff. Also, because the person being examined is a nobleman and his wife is coming, he's like, I don't think that they would really just cut this guy open. So we actually revised the entire sequence to be just an inspection of the exterior, which is less dramatic but more appropriate, and it gives all the information that we needed to give Andreas anyway. And then the doctors from Bologna talking about Pliny the Elder. So I knew I wanted to have this conversation between these doctors from Bologna and Werner Stolz. Werner Stolz is this extremely arrogant doctor that is kind of the foil to Andreas. He was university educated, and he's not very successful, and he kind of resents Andreas because Andreas is a university dropout who is very successful. Never mind that Andreas is very depressed about it. But it sets up this rivalry, and Andreas comes into this conversation between the doctors and Werner, and I was like, what would they be talking about? And Winston said, how about the irrelevance of Pliny's natural history? This was something that was being discussed at the time. Most late medieval medicine was still fundamentally classical. A lot of the texts that they used were over 1,000 years old. And so they were having these conversations actively saying, like, should we still be using this, or should we write new texts on these things? Also, this is just prior to the rise of what we understand as naturalism now, so increased study of botany and the properties of plants, which kind of, again, everyone was still kind of going along with very old texts about. So he helped point me toward this. How am I doing here? Not too bad. Okay. So primary sources, I didn't actually rely on that many. The Fournier Register, Pope Benedict XII, originally was a an inquisitor in southern France, what is now southern France, and he questioned, interrogated wayward Cathars to bring them back into the fold. But the things that are interesting in these Inquisition records is that it shows that peasantry were capable of their own independent thought, which I think is an important thing that often gets lost when talking about the peasantry. They had imagination. They could have theoretical thinking. This is also carried over in another character, Václav, but they have brains. They're not educated, but they can dream and imagine things on their own, and they will fill in gaps of dogma. This is actually one of the causes of the initial papal Inquisition is when Catholicism shot across Europe, there were a lot of blanks that could be filled in by whatever the folk beliefs were. So anyway, that was one of the sources I used to see that example. And of course, the rule of Saint Benedict. It was, sort of in the lack of observance of it, this abbey was a double monastery. Those were condemned by the Pope because of nonsense going on between the monks and the nuns. Also Benedictines, it was the original rule, but so many orders that came after were reform movements, whether it was Cistercians or, of course, the Franciscans and later the Poor Clares who come into the city or into the abbey. Reforms after reform, so understanding the rule and how it was observed or not observed by individuals within the abbey was important. And the Munich Manual of Demonic Magic, which I will get back to, but that's a fun one. Secondary sources. We cannot all receive divine inspiration directly from the source like Hildegard can, so I had to look at a lot of secondary sources to understand what was going on. I had to make a sub-selection of these. I'll focus on the important ones, I hope. So the Revolution of 1525 by Peter Blickel was, it was written for the 450th anniversary. The 500th is coming up next year. But it was one of those things where a bunch of historians were all like, it's the 450th anniversary. We're all gonna write on this. And it was then later translated into English by Eric Middlefort, and it doesn't really matter. Anyway, wow, when I started reading this, I'm like, there's a lot of ideological conflict going on here. I was like, what are you guys doing? But of course, it was many of the East German historians were focusing on a Marxist interpretation, a largely materialistic interpretation of the German peasant uprising. And generally speaking, the West German historians were characterizing it as fundamentally religious or political and not material in nature. Peter Blickel was like, it's not completely either of these things. It was more nuanced. First of all, one of the things he talks about is 1525 didn't just come out of nowhere. It was a continuation of previous uprisings, the Bundschuh uprisings, which took place over many years, and of course, the Niklaushausen uprising, which was quite different in character, but the underlying concerns had been there and they had continued building over time. And of course, there were these arguments in the contemporary setting between, whether it was Luther, are these guys being inspired by Luther? Are they referencing Luther? Some of the peasants would say, no, we have our own grievances. We don't need you, Luther. But the peasants were aware of these previous uprisings. Even if not in detail, they were aware of the conditions that they lived in, which were worsening over time. Oops, sorry. So the context was more nuanced, and often, even though the 12 articles were representative of a widespread amount of concerns, each community had their own individual concerns that were based on their material reality. And they were founded because it was important to ground them in a religious understanding, so very often the 12 articles refer to their reasoning being derived from God. Sorry. Can't speak German or English today. The Return of Martin Guerre by, unfortunately, again, the late, great Nathalie Simon-Davis. This deals with a 16th century case of French imposture. So specifically, there was a man named Martin Guerre. He became married. He kind of sucked. He left. And he just disappeared for 7 years. And then he came back, and everyone's like, Martin, you're back. That's great. You seem like you're a much better person now. And then people said, I don't think this is actually the real Martin. But this was only after he had been around for a little while. And he was brought to trial several times. And a lot of people debated whether he was the real Martin Guerre or not. And they were like, okay, you're innocent. But then, dramatically, during the third trial, I think, the real Martin Guerre did appear, and it turned out that this guy had been an imposter the entire time. So this was a well-documented case by one of the jurists at the time from Toulouse, and it was made into a French film, which is with Gérard Depardieu, which is very, very good. I recommend watching it. But the consultant for the movie was Natalie Zeman Davis, and she was like, damn, I did all this work to be a consultant, I'm just going to write this book. So she wrote The Return of Martin Guerre, and we just took the whole story, basically, and we put it right into Pentiment. But the very funny thing, I thought, is that I very often see players say that this is the least plausible part of everything in Pentiment, and it is the one thing that we took almost directly from a historical example. It's even called, the quest in the game is called The Return of Martin Bauer. So it's really, really obvious, but anyway, some people still didn't get it. Peasant Fires by Richard Wunderlich. So this is dealing with Hans Böhm of Niklashausen. Hans Böhm was a shepherd and a drummer, and he saw a vision of Mary, and Mary told him that God was mad at people in society for the way things were going, that he should go to town and he should burn his drum in a bonfire of the vanities, and that he should preach to the people, and that she would continue to appear to him and tell him what to say. What he said to the people, though, was real aggressive. He said that the clergy was bad, that the clergy should be murdered, that the nobles were bad, and also, this is the key bad thing, is that the emperor was also bad. This is the thing that in the German peasant uprising, they wisely were like, we don't have any beef with the emperor, okay? But yes, he said that, and very swiftly knights ran in and grabbed him, and he was burned to death. So that did not go very well. And in The Ship of Fools, Sebastian Brandt. So The Ship of Fools was very popular, very well illustrated, beautiful woodcuts in it, and there are examples of all these people that are sort of wayward, foolish people, and he has a portion dedicated to the bagpiper of Niklashausen and the people who follow him. So this became, in the decades following the death of the drummer of Niklashausen, of Hans Böhm, it became sort of more well-known by people who had access to education. These inspired various things in the game in a sort of fractured sense. So we do have, we have a story of a Marian apparition that was the founding of Our Lady of the Labyrinth. Labyrinth is very instrumental to the story of Pentiment. The story is sort of shrouded in mist. Everyone says, well, I heard it from this person, and the priest told it to me, and someone told it to the priest, and someone told it to the person before the priest. But yes, someone saw Mary with a labyrinth, and he went with the drawing of the labyrinth to the bishop, and the bishop had seen the labyrinth in a dream, and he took that as a sign that he should go there, and then they both saw Mary, and Mary told the bishop, you have to build a church here for them. And that's the story of the church. Also, the Ship of Fools does play pretty centrally within the story. And also importantly, the peasants are very careful in how they talk about their uprising, because they believe that a lot of their complaints are derived from religious authority, not like actual ecclesiastical authority, but like these are God-given rights. These are rights that are given to man by God, and they're being taken away from us by the nobility. And they're also very careful at certain points to say, we do not have a problem with the Duke of Bavaria. Don't get it twisted. We do not have a problem with the emperor. We have a problem with our abbot. Our abbot is corrupting God's will. Faithful Executioner. This is a great book. I even reused that illustration you had in your presentation. So this is a book by Joel F. Harrington about Franz Schmidt. He was an executioner in Nuremberg in the 16th century. He had an unusual character in that he was a very upstanding citizen. During this time period, executioners, well, I can't think of one where executioners are looked highly upon, but they certainly were not looked well upon in the 16th century. His father was forced into being an executioner, which is kind of a crazy story, but then they had this stain of dishonor that Franz Schmidt was determined to remove. He wanted to bring honor, to become ehrlich for his family line. In contrast, our executioner is more of a typical executioner. So Harrington describes that most executioners, because they are in some ways outcast, they're given to excessive drink, they're kind of loners, and they associate with other people who are kind of outsiders. In this case, Richard associates with the Romani tinker, Václav, and also with Smokey, Adam Kohler, who is the charcoal burner. These are people who also are on the margins of society. People interact with them, but they're not considered sort of like good people. He is present at the archdeacon's inquiry, standing menacingly. Executioners were also torturers. So very often they would be employed in processes to extract information. He doesn't do anything, but he's just standing there menacingly so that anyone who's being interrogated understands that there's the potential threat of being tortured by him. And he does perform executions in the story, including one that is botched, which was not uncommon given the method of execution with a sword against a person who's kneeling upright. I don't know, maybe someone could have thought of a better way to do that. In England, they used an axe with a block, probably more reliable. So here you see an example. You can actually, a lot of people can miss this because Richard is only there for the last day, but you can go and have a meal with him. He hangs out with Smokey and Václav at the edge of town. And here you can see, this is when Andreas is speaking to Jakob Essler. Jakob Essler is the archdeacon performing his inquiry. The guards are there because they would be accompanying a person of the archdeacon's stature, but also Richard is there. I thought we edited that sword out, but apparently he has the sword. He wouldn't just be carrying the sword around. But that is a proper executioner sword with the rounded edge, which, because it's not meant for combat, it's meant for decapitation. And here are the different executions that he performed. Execution method did vary depending on the status of the victim. Also, it was up to the discretion of the magistrate, or in this case, the archdeacon. And also, the executioner could advocate for different forms of execution. So, however he got to this point, Richard does strangle the women to death and he decapitates the men. Lucky takes it pretty stoically and just kneels there. Prior Ferenc in the lower left corner attempts to get away, and the execution is botched, which requires 3 strikes. This, again, was not an uncommon occurrence. Very nasty. The cheese and the worms. So this is a microhistory about a Friulian miller named Minocchio. Minocchio was extremely literate and well-read and opinionated, and it was this last point that made a big problem for him because he had very weird ideas and he would not shut up about them. He would talk to his neighbors, he would talk to travelers. He had read a number of books about different cosmological ideas, heretical ideas. He also talked to people traveling through the area, and then he would talk to his neighbors. He was tried for heresy 3 times, and it was specifically because he would not stop talking to his neighbors about it. And they complained, and the inquisitors said, 1, recant, 2, shut up. He was, in the end, I find this extraordinary, he wasn't condemned for heresy, he was condemned for being a heresiarch, which is the founder of a heretical movement. His ideas were so weird and so all-encompassing that they thought that, and because he was evangelizing to people, they thought, okay, you're trying to actually start a heretical movement, clearly because you will not stop talking to people about this, and he was burned to death. We reflected this through Václav the Tinker. Václav is not supposed to be sort of typical of a Romani. He is a tinker, but his background is pretty vague. Where he exactly came from, he does travel by himself. He does say that he's read a lot and he talks about a lot of things. And he has a lot of opinions and he talks with everyone. And again, Smokey says, Václav, you've already gotten in trouble with inquisitors, so please leave it alone. But Václav has his own weird cosmology. It's somewhat Gnostic. It's also somewhat spiritual in nature. It's very unique. He does talk about Lucifer forming the world, kind of a demiurge idea, and he goes on from there. It gets crazier and crazier from a Catholic perspective, so everyone's kind of like, guy, just take it easy. Women as Scribes by Alison Beach. Alison Beach wrote this great book about the existence and prominence of female scribes in 12th century Bavaria. A lot of this was analyzed through the use of paleography and figuring out the different book hands and where they came from. One of the figures that she focuses on is Demot of Wesselbrunn. She was renowned for having an exceptional book hand. She worked in a sealed cell next to the church because, again, in many cases, even when there were men and women working as part of a process of creating these books, they wouldn't just be hanging out in the same room. So there are stories and images of, basically 2 sides where there's a monk on one side and none on the other, and they pass things through a kind of cloth-covered window so that they can do the work that they each need to do. Beach and other academics used paleography to identify her hand. So there were certain characteristics of her book hand, which again was renowned for its beauty, that they were able to identify in a number of manuscripts. This is, of course, very important because these authors didn't sign like, hey, I'm Demut, I wrote this. So this is reflected in Sister Amelie, who is a mystic in the story. Her previous vocation is hidden by her confessor. Because the confessor, she is a mystic of effective piety, and the confessor, they needed a priest to basically interpret her visions. Also, being a mystic was a very dangerous thing. What's the difference necessarily between someone like Hildegard of Bingen and Joan of Arc? It's prominence and power. So having, or even if looking at Marjorie Kemp or someone like that, having a priest who can help mediate these visions and these ideas that a female mystic had was very important. However, in this case, it also puts her under the control of that person, which is corrupted to certain ends, and of course reflected in the thread puller, ink and script being very distinctive. And finally, two books I want to talk about are Magic in the Cloister and Unlocked Books. These are by Sophie Page and Benedict Lang. I will say this is part of a fantastic series called Magic and History. I think there's like 14 books. They're all great. I recommend them. Magic is a very muddy idea. There's lots of shifting opinions on what is magic and what's good magic and what's bad magic and what's questionable magic. By its written nature, of course, this is trafficked by monks and scribes. They are the people who are literate. They're copying them. They have access to them. Sometimes they're sort of traded as curiosities. Other times they're studied, and some rarely tried to do the things that were in them. There were prohibitions against this by the University of Paris. There were authors like Albertus Magnus who wrote defenses about certain types of study that he thought were not quite so bad. Individual abbeys had wildly varying attitudes towards this. So at some places, none of this happened. Other places, it became kind of a matter of course because things could get very lax. Magic could also be justified for a holy purpose. For example, I think Sophie Page gives an example where a relic is stolen, and they use magic to try to find the thief because they're like, well, yeah, I guess magic is not ideal, but we don't want the relic to go missing. We got to use some magic to find it. That being said, Central European attitudes were markedly different. So this is where Benedict Lang, who is a Hungarian historian, came in, and he talks about how in Poland, Bohemia, and Hungary, there was a slight shift, specifically in the realm of learned magic, court sort of advisors who often were priests who would practice magic for the purpose of helping the nobility. This could take various forms, one of which was theurgy, so the invocation of angels. This was seen in different ways in different places, but in Central Europe, it was generally regarded in the right circumstances as being good. I'm invoking angels, helping the king. You don't want that? That's a good thing, right? So in the game, this is reflected through Prior Ferenc and his attitudes toward theurgy and necromancy. Ferenc is Hungarian, and he does clearly circulate magical texts, and he loves talking about them. He does read them, but he insists that he only practices theurgy. This is something that he does admit to under pressure, and he says he's just trying to help the abbey. So he says, like, I just want the abbey to do better, and I'm asking the angels to help us. What's so bad about that? But he strongly denies any involvement in necromancy, and in fact, there is at least some written evidence that suggests that when he's requested to do necromancy by the Baron, he says, no, I am not going to do that. And then there's Brother Guy and his...
What is necromancy?
Necromancy is black magic. I mean, it does vary. Yeah, it does vary by definition depending on the time, but it is generally considered to be bad magic. There are different classifications over time. But for example, there is this Manual of Demonic Magic, which would definitely classify as necromancy. This is the Munich Manual of Demonic Magic. I believe it is CL 849 in the Munich Stadtbibliothek. And it's full of demonic invocations, calling upon demons to either give you power or do harm to other people. Brother Guy doesn't have any problem with necromancy. Brother Guy doesn't have a lot of problems with a lot of things. He tries to use this manual to make Otto senseless, not to kill him, but basically to shut him up. It does not work, but Otto dies anyway. So, in conclusion, I could talk about this forever. I referred to maybe a quarter of the books that we actually referenced. There's also a ton of articles that I looked at. The historical consultants were invaluable. I mean, obviously, I could not have done this without their assistance. The primary and secondary sources answered so many questions that I had, stuff that I really would have been lost without them. So I would say developers, if there are any developers watching this, contact historians. All I did, by the way, is I read one of Christopher DeHamel's books, and I was like, Corpus Christi, ... there's your email address. Would you like to be a consultant on a video game? And he said, I don't know. But I convinced him. It worked. And there was also Deborah Cashin. There was some book I was reading, I think about Italian and Hungarian art, and she was, I think, the editor of it, and I had a question, and I asked her if she wanted to be a consultant, and she said she didn't have time, but she just answered my question, so which was quite lovely. So yeah, contact historians. I think one of the big obstacles is that we don't know how to necessarily, or we're nervous about how to contact each other. Historians, if you hear or see that someone is making a historical game, why not reach out? If it's in your field of expertise, say like, hey, do you need an advisor for this? Do you need help with it? Maybe they'll say no, but maybe they'll say, oh, you know what? Actually, we could use that. Let's turn the extraordinary into the typical. I think that ultimately, these process, by the way, I should say that the process of, maybe it's because I have a history background, but it was pretty easy to just talk to people, get references, look things up, collaborate, work out ideas. I don't think this needs to be extraordinary. It's not that Pentiment or the Assassin's Creed games need to be, like, they're the only games that do this. I think this can and should become a typical process. Maybe it doesn't require 3 historians, maybe it's only 1, maybe it's only part-time. But this should be how things are done, I think. Also, I found out that you can log into JSTOR with a Google account. I don't have academic credentials, but I was able to do it. So that's a little tip after you're no longer in academia. Thank you.